So yes, we've been looking at chapter 5 of Fredrickson's book and looking at the ways that the church developed in the context of the Roman Empire in the first 3 centuries. Um, and the development after the time of Constantine as well. A lot of theological controversies happen after the time of Constantine for reasons that we'll get into, but even prior to the time of Constantine, the question of who Jesus was in relation to the Father. It was Jesus, and there are a lot of possibilities, right? Because even the Romans and the Greeks had the idea of a human being taking on godlike qualities. Was Jesus like that? Was he just another person like Achilles or Augustus or whomever, whoever the Greeks or the Romans tried to divinize themselves? Or was there something essentially fundamentally different about who Jesus was? And early on, it came to be understood that Jesus was with God in the beginning. He was the Logos. He was that ordering principle of the universe. And a lot of this was influenced by several things. First of all, Platonic philosophy, but more specifically, Neoplatonic philosophy. And I mentioned to you uh, Philo of Alexandria last time, who really helped to bring Jewish thought and Greek thought together. And he helped develop this idea of the Logos as being the ordered forms in the mind of God. And it was a very easy step to make to say that Jesus was identified with these ordered forms. Now, that wasn't Philo. Philo was completely Jewish. But Philo was well enough known in the first, second, and third centuries for people to be able to use that philosophical concept and apply it to Jesus. But then the question becomes, well, was Jesus created? If he was created, then he must be kind of a demigod or something under God. And theologians, people like Origen and early theologians, Tertullian and others, Irenaeus, did not want to go that far. They wanted to affirm Jesus being of one, well, as Tertullian puts it, of one substance with the Father. And so there were all these controversies was that had to be hammered out. And eventually, and this is before any councils. So in the early first 3 centuries, we have a lot of varying Christianities, right? The Christianities that Fredrickson uh, you know, uh, uses in the title of her book. Um, and then Jesus, who is connected with creation itself, uh, what was his relationship? Well, early on, this idea of Jesus being begotten and not made was something that came to be established, and this is really in relationship to the Psalm of the Old Testament Psalm, Psalm number 2, which was a coronation psalm, uh, where God says to his son, "Today you are my son, today I have begotten you." And that word comes to be seen as having, kind of a distinctive, unique quality to it, that Jesus wasn't created, he was begotten. But this idea of the relationship between God the Father and God the Son was going to persist all the way up until, well, the Council of Chalcedon in 451. And so today, what we're going to look at is that period that comes after the rise of Constantine. Constantine, who is just a watershed figure in all of this. Uh, the last time I also mentioned, about the idea of creation ex nihilo that develops, and I wanted to mention to you, if you've never been to the National Cathedral, there is a window in the National Cathedral that's very uh, unique with respect to, in comparison to all the other church windows that we see around the world, really. And it's called the space window or the creation window, which of course commemorates and gives affirms the idea of God creating the universe in 6 days and resting on the seventh. But what's unique about this, and some of you may already know this, and maybe you all do, but I've always been fascinated with this idea at the center. You can see where my cursor is. This window was built around a moon rock that was brought back from the Apollo, whatever, the Neil Armstrong Apollo 11 mission. And so it's just a good example of how, in the United States at least, we have not been afraid to merge, science and religion in some sort of very um, creative but affirming, uh, collaborative way. So have you been to the National Cathedral and seen this? It's a magnificent window. It's not a small thing. It's a good 15 feet at least, so um, all of this that we've been talking about can be summarized, all of the controversies that we've been talking about in the first 3 centuries, actually 100s to the 200s, and then thereafter, at one point there comes to be a bishop, or not a bishop, but an elder by the name of Arius, who comes to be the kind of the whipping boy, you might say, for everything that is unorthodox, that suggests that Jesus is somehow unequal with the Father. And so we have, and for the next 3 centuries, going to have a lot of people being defined as Arians. It's almost like being defined as unpatriotic or a liberal, right, these days. And so Arianism is going to take on that kind of, a bad name for anybody who's unorthodox. But there's going to be a variety of orthodoxies that are going to proceed from this century. And what eventually happens here, see if I can, there we go. What eventually happens here is probably the most important event in Christian history, apart from the crucifixion. But the whole world is going to change after this, when Constantine becomes the emperor. Constantine enters the equation in 312. Uh, there's conflict in Rome. He and his troops are going to take over Rome, and he's going to be named as emperor. But to do so, he must fight a battle against the current emperor. And it's come to be known as the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 of the Common Era. And the legend goes, and we're not really clear that this ever happened, but the legend that's built up around it is that on the night before the battle, Constantine had a vision, and he looked up into the sky and he saw a cross, the red cross, and he heard the words in hoc signio, whatever the word for in hoc signio, in this sign conquer. Now, the reason I bring this up is because we see this in the church all the time. You probably notice um, uh, the gold cross on the communion table, and it says IHS. And I'm probably telling you something you already know, but when I was a kid, I always thought, yeah, that's weird. That's not even how you spell his. I thought it meant like, it is belonging to God. It's his, right? But it's IHS. Well, this is the Latin in hoc signio, in this uh, sign, conquer. And it is at this point that the cross becomes, you know, almost synonymous with the hilt, the upside down, the hilt of a sword, and the cross that it makes. The sword and the cross together go hand in hand. Um, but Constantine does proceed, and he has all of his soldiers paint that cross on their shields and in other ways, and they win the battle decisively. Constantine becomes emperor, and he doesn't forget the the sign that helped him through. And it's interesting, he does not become baptized until he's on his deathbed. Uh, but his mother, Helena, was a devout Christian, and we don't know what that relationship was all about. We don't really have any historical records, but she is, seen as kind of the patroness of Christianity, while Constantine is the patron from 312 all the way to his death. Um, I can't remember when his death was exactly, but he is he really turns the tables for the whole Roman Empire. And it's important for us to remember what Fredrickson was talking about before, how, the Ordo, the religious order of the day was that, you sacrifice to the pagan gods, you obey their precepts, you acknowledge that they are the patrons of the city, and you do so in a very prescribed manner. Well, all that gets thrown out. And it happens in stages over about 10 years. But the first stage, if you look at our timeline down here, is something called the Edict of Milan. And this is the place where you know Constantine's predecessors, some of them, especially people like Diocletian and Decius and Nero, were persecuting Christians. And the Edict of Milan made it very clear that there should be tolerance, religious tolerance. And we're not quite at the place yet where Christianity becomes the religion, but this is the first step toward that. Um, in about 10 years from that time, Constantine is able to consolidate both the East and West. We forget that Eastern Christianity and the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire were always kind of at odds with each other. And different emperors, and they're far enough away that they weren't in each other's face all the time, so they developed differently, right? Uh, Constantine is able to consolidate both East and West, so he becomes the premier emperor over the Roman Empire. And it's not long after that that he decides that he is going to establish um, law in the land that is based on Christian theology in many ways. Now, it's not because of his devoutness, but he was shrewd enough of a emperor to know that the organization of the Roman Empire had already fallen apart. It was hard to find a place where there wasn't conflict and where people weren't at odds with each other. But here is this church, here is this Christian tradition that has churches that seem to be in communication with each other, enough so that they have effectively agreed upon what their scriptures are, what their liturgy would be like, and all of these things. And he takes that structure and he turns it into a political structure, at once political and religious. And that is where the Council of Nicaea comes to the fore. And it was in the Council of Nicaea that many of these controversies about who Jesus was and his relationship to the Father come to be set in stone. Now, it would develop over the next 100 years. There would be other councils as well. The Council of, Ephesus, the Council of Constantinople, the Council of Chalcedon being the big four: Nicaea, Ephesus, Constantinople, and Chalcedon. And so the remainder of Fredrickson's chapter, from about page 124 to about whatever the end of the chapter is, 143, really talks about the development of the church after Constantine and his political shrewdness in choosing the church as the model, or choosing the infrastructure of the church as something that could be utilized by him, as well as getting involved in the theological debates of the church. So I talked enough there. Let me stop and see if there are any questions.
Dan, it seems to me that throughout history, the history we're talking about clear up to today, that we're still talking about multiple Christianities. And I think particularly the current environment is very clear with the uh, Pentecostal and Baptist evangelicals would like to impose and make this a Christian nation. Uh,
Yeah,
but which Christianity is not really in question. It's I think they made it pretty clear.
right. Yeah, I know. I agree completely. And while we're reading this, we're seeing the very same thing, right? Um, there is a certain advantage, regardless regardless of how religious you are. I'm not entirely convinced that Constantine was really that religious. He just took advantage of the situation that he saw and ran with it. His mother, Helena, uh, uh, was the one who really kind of ran interference for him. She was the devout one. You might know about her as the woman who went to Jerusalem in search of the place where Christ was crucified on the cross, and the result was eventually the building of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. You know, I can't, and I don't. I'm not a historian enough to know what Constantine's uh, religious faith was like, but I think it's telling that he did not get baptized until uh, he was on his deathbed. Um, I think he knew how to manipulate. He knew how to see which way the wind was blowing, as they say, right? And the wind was blowing quite nicely in that, over the past 200 years, because of various persecutions, uh, church fathers and bishops in the churches were, periodically coming together in their various councils and synods to try to decide on how to maintain unity in a church that was always being threatened to fall apart. And he took that structure and he put it in place. And he immediately, beginning at around well, shortly after 313, he begins to favor the Christian bishops. And this completely changes, the whole scenario. Uh, First of all, the bishops were organized. They had a number of duties that involved, being in touch with the people. So there you had your mouthpiece, who was, a person who was organizing the urban church. And remember, these churches are primarily urban. Uh, what's what's interesting about this, and Frederickson points it out, is that in the countryside, paganism is going to persist all the way up to the death of Constantine. But in the urban churches, you have this structure in place that Constantine is going to be able to use. The bishops had these duties. I think I can't remember if I mentioned these last time. Um, I'm on page 124. As a loose federation of scattered communities, these monarchical churches sought to align on issues of doctrine and discipline across vast distances. Bishops attempted through regional councils and through correspondence to stay coordinated with each other. Another testament to their administrative organization. Letters threaded independent churches together. A papyrus fragment reveals that Irenaeus's work against heresies, written in Lyon in the 180s, had already made its way to Egypt by the turn of the century. Regional synods convened to coordinate responses to various challenges. Uh, and then, prestige and property bequeathed by the faithful accrued to the bishops. This is even before Constantine, especially in the wealthy major cities. And as uh, Fredrickson points out, these bishops, in short, represented and offered an empire-wide network of influence and support. Constantine's patronage would amplify what the bishops were already doing in their communities. The bishops, in turn, offered him a talent pool for a new kind of magistrate. So it's a very shrewd political move on Constantine's part. But then Constantine decides to get involved in what the churches, what the bishops had been involved in, at least intellectually, right? And that is the theology. And so in order to further unify what appeared to be an already fairly well unified structure, he calls a council, the Council of Nicaea. And Nicaea is a good place to do this because it's kind of halfway between East and West. Don't forget about the fact that these churches, there's already a divide that's starting to develop that reflects the divide in the Roman Empire between East and West. The Western churches and the Eastern churches are starting to see things a little bit differently. I mean, all the way to the point of the celebration of Easter. So they had quite an agenda, and I'll read that because I can't remember exactly what the agenda was all about. More than 200 bishops, I'm on page 126, assembled at Nicaea. The vast majority were from the East. Only a handful were from the West. The Roman bishop Sylvester did not attend, but sent 2 presbyters to represent him. A clogged agenda confronted them, not only deciding on the nature of Christ, which we all think of, that was the main deal, but not so much, thus of God, but also fixing the date of Easter, which wandered between lunar, thus Jewish, and solar dates in different communities. That's another interesting aspect of this, is that the early church, most likely the earliest church, followed the Jewish lunar calendar. But as it moved into, becoming more collaborative, you might say, with the Roman Empire, the Julian calendar, which is, as was known at that time, comes to be the dominant calendar in the church. We still see this problem today. Can you tell me when we celebrate Easter, anybody? No, because it could be April, it could be March. It's always moving, right? And this is the problem in the changing of the calendar, the Jewish versus the so-called Christian calendar, which wandered between lunar, thus Jewish, and solar dates in different communities. They had to sort out a policy for episcopal jurisdictions, which imitated imperial provincial organization. So isn't that interesting? The provincial organization of the empire now becomes the episcopal jurisdictional regions. Over what extra-provincial territories would each metropolitan bishop exercise authority? What was to be done about the disciplinary schisms over how to reintegrate those who had lapsed, which followed in the wake of the first imperial persecutions? You might remember that, the Novatianists and the Donatists in Rome. And then the last, what was the status of clerical marriage and clerical marriage? Isn't that interesting? We still see this today, We have all that crazy Paul, we have conflict in the letters of Paul. Paul wants a bishop to be a man of one wife, in the later letters of Paul. But in 1 Corinthians, he talks about, if I have my druthers, I would like to see that all of you were not married, right? So the West took one approach and the East took one approach. And to this day, the Greek Orthodox priests marry while the Roman Catholic priests do not. So any comments about that? Easter, or some of the more picayune details of organizing. This is all administrative stuff. Thoughts about this? Well, the theological order of the day was to identify, you know, uh, the relationship of Jesus to God, and we've pretty much established this right from the very beginning. Uh, and we recite this periodically and very frequently at First Presbyterian, the Nicene Creed, that, Jesus was in the beginning with God of true God, God, fully human, true light from true light, of one substance with the Father. That's the word homoousios, that comes from Tertullian. That early theological that theological identification of God and Jesus as being one substance, one ousia, one essence, and three hypostases, three persons. All of this comes to be affirmed in the Nicene Creed. And with this, we get the idea of orthodoxy as being established. Orthodoxy is established. So, um, questions?
Dan,
Yeah.
um, were the inclusion of the four gospels we have today um into the canon established by one of these councils?
No, no, it wasn't. It it is something that has been going on for over, well, for about 1,000 years. You know, from the but the beginning of it is with Irenaeus, who identifies Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And his reasoning, I don't know if he's speaking metaphorically, he says, as there are four directions and there are four winds, so must there be four gospels, right? It just seems kind of arbitrary, right? Uh, but really what it boiled down to is that what were the letters that were being read? What were the gospels and letters that were being most read in the churches? And it happened to be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as well as these letters of Paul. But there were also these letters that were attributed to Paul that weren't, that weren't authentic. Well, they get included. But even by the time of the Reformation, you've got people like Luther saying Revelation should be out of the canon. Uh, the book of Jude, where's that come? That shouldn't be in there. People had concerns about Hebrews because of its very Jewish nature. And so, Denny, I'm going to have to review my knowledge of this very complex development, because I can't give you a date exactly when the canon comes to be established. And remember, we've got a Roman Catholic canon, and we have a Protestant canon as well. The Protestant canon has 27 New Testament books and 39 Old Testament books. The Roman Catholic New Testament is roughly the same as the Protestant, but they have a lot more books, intertestamental literature, than we do. So I'm sorry to overcomplicate your question, but
Fine.
it's a complicated one. I just realized that I don't have my phone with me to see what time it is, so I'm going to go get that really quickly. You all discuss amongst yourselves. Well, just as I thought, my internal clock told me, well, it's about 12:30. We better keep moving on. Are there any other questions about this? Things get really complicated very quickly. Well, with Constantine, the church really kind of wins the imperial lottery, you might say. There are a lot of advantages that come with that. You have Constantine's favor, which, is no small matter, right? Uh, a lot of wealth from Constantine's own coffers, from, from his own slush fund, you might say, gets transferred into the church. A lot of this had to do with, ensuring that people had certain grain rations, and the bishops were the people in place to administer all of this. And with this comes an increasing amount of power with the bishops. Okay. And this is going to have ramifications for later on, because here you give the Bishop of Rome, let's say, a bunch of money to, care for his, his administrators, his presbyters and whatnot, but also to ensure that the people are fed. Well, now you have, in fact, Fredrickson calls it something akin to a militia. You have people who are more, uh, who in some cases can be more loyal to the bishop who's feeding them to the emperor himself. And this is going to develop into some problems a little bit later on. But this is a way that Constantine is organizing so that, continuing the whole bread and circus routine, you might say. But then he does something really interesting as well. He despoils a lot of the pagan temples. He robs from the rich to give to the poor, so to speak. Constantine does. Um, he, melts down some of the, the fineries, some of the furniture, you might say, in these temples, and distributes them among the churches. So now you get a pretty clear sense that if there's not just tolerance, as was established by the Edict of Milan, but there's certainly favoritism. Money is going to a place where money had never been before. Another thing that, is very positive is that Constantine puts a lot of effort into building uh, churches. I mean, establishing churches not as, meeting houses where people would go, but to actually build churches as imperial buildings, right? They came to be the symbols of imperial power and majesty. And this is where we get the first introduction of what comes to later be known as Romanesque architecture. Here's the picture of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. You can, from what you might know of, Gothic cathedrals, there's not a lot of light in this. They had not developed the technology or the engineering to be able to build those high vaulted windows that would later come in the 13th century. But, they were rather dark places. You can see these small windows here, but in many ways they were built like a fortress. They were built like a fortress, which kind of begs the question. I mean, is this a reflection of kind of the militaristic or martial attitude of, an emperor who, an emperor and an empire that, maintains its peace through the power of the sword? Very interesting question, but of course you know this building. We've talked about it before. I've already mentioned the grain rations, but all of this tends to create a situation where you have bishops who are residing in places like this, right, who are giving out grain rations, who have authority not only over just the physical lives of the people in their, jurisdiction, but also in the spiritual lives of the people in this jurisdiction. And all of a sudden, the question is going to be raised: who is in charge? Who's more important? You might know that the movie that starred Peter O'Toole and Richard Burton. Was it Peter O'Toole? It was Richard Burton but it was Beckett, Murder in the Cathedral. This goes all the way back to this time period we're talking about. Eventually, the question is going to be raised: who is more important here, the bishop or the emperor? And we're going to see that after Constantine, especially in a time of Theodosius the First and Theodosius the Second, where the emperors are going to have to come to heel at the request of the bishops, but all of it's being set up right now, right? The status of the bishops is being is increased here. So I just want to show you some pictures. This was the inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, looks like, nothing in the way of windows. You have this, this dome up the top shedding its light on, the actual sepulchre itself. And that's what it looks like from the top. And this would have been during the Tenebrae service, the Easter service. But this image kind of gives you a sense. I mean, this is still under the care and jurisdiction of the Eastern Orthodox Church. So you see the Orthodox crosses just silhouetted against the landscape here. Nicaea was, had a number of Eastern Orthodox bishops or Eastern bishops that were represented, and that part of the world still maintains a very Eastern understanding of Jesus and Jesus' relationship with God, as well as the Holy Spirit, something we'll get into. Okay, before I move on, before the death of Constantine, would anybody like to jump in and say anything? Well, the conflict between the bishop and the emperor would really come to a head. Well, would really start to show itself with a man by the name of Athanasius of Alexandria. Remember, there are some really important cities. There's Rome, there's Antioch, there's Alexandria, and of course there's Constantinople, and I'm missing another one that's in there. Uh, well, anyway, and these cities are all vying for their own power and prestige as well. And the way they're doing this is through theological debate and controversy. But it would be Athanasius, from whom we get the Athanasian Creed that focuses on the Trinity, who would really begin to push the boundaries in terms of, no, the emperor needs to be beholden to the church, not vice versa. And this controversy came to the fore around that whole question of homoousia, right? Is Jesus of the same substance as the Father, or is he of just a similar substance? This seems crazy for us, right? Why would we, waste so much time on something like this? But the notion of homoousia comes to be something that is reintroduced into, the equation itself. Now, we got the Nicene Creed, we had the, Council of Nicaea, but you still had people who were pushing the margin. And the whole notion of power politics really reveals itself. I can't remember what it was I wanted to read here, so I'm probably going to find that. Oh, here it is. The definition, on page 130, talking about these power politics. The definition of orthodoxy had long outgrown their New Testament sources. I mean, where in the New Testament do we talk about homoousia and homoousia and things like this? All of a sudden, these guys are free agents, right? References to scripture are not being made at all. So what is the standard by which they are making these arguments? Well, it's philosophy, but there are some geopolitical considerations that are being taken into account as well. Had long outgrown their New Testament sources. None of those authors had been thinking or teaching in terms of ousia, none of the New Testament authors. The content of orthodoxy in this period was itself under construction. The prerogatives to decide which definition of orthodoxy would prevail was no less contested. The question had practical consequences. Decisions determined who received imperial sanction and who received support. So as with all things, there's there's money, there's support, there's power at play. So there is great contention among, some of these cities for the support, not so much the theological support, but for the, physical, material support of the emperor. Well, things get really interesting now because something entirely different is introduced in the entire mix. Um, Constantine had a son by the name of Constantius, and Constantius had a cousin by the name of Julian. When Constantius dies, Constantius II, I should also point out here, Constantine was very much like George Foreman. He had a number of sons. Most of them bore some resemblance of the name Constantine. There was Constantius, there was Constans, there was, oh, there's another one in there. Constantius, Constans, Constantine, maybe, but there are a number of constants. So it gets very, very confusing. But Constantius II was uh, uh, the emperor up until 361. And upon his death, one of his cousins who survived basically the fratricide that Constantius put forth, uh, as as we saw with, when we read the book on Herod, one of the ways that, emperors and kings ensured that their line would persist was they would kill all of their male relatives. And this is what Constantius did. But one of his little cousins by the name of Julian, uh, somehow Julian and Gallus somehow missed, you know, missed the parade, and they were spared. And upon Constantius's death, Julian becomes emperor. And prior to this, Julian had already shown himself to be a pretty able military general. And so he had the support of a lot of people in the military. And remember, the military is a place where a lot of pagan rituals still persisted. This was not a monolithic Christian empire under Constantine or under Constantius. There were still pockets, for example, the Roman senators, the army, or, the military, the people in the countryside. Well, apparently Julian's association with the military and his support of the military led him to completely take the empire into a new direction. Now he wanted to organize the empire around what might be called a pagan church. He wanted to use the organization of the church to promote pagan worship. And he does some interesting things. He restores the Jewish temple, first of all, in Jerusalem, kind of as a slap in the face of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, that was being built, down the hill from that, right? And he reinstitutes pagan sacrifice or I shouldn't say pagan, blood sacrifice in the Jewish temple. He was so interested, so into blood sacrifice that some people began to think, man, this is a little bit over the top, right? But all he tried to do was to try to reintroduce, it's in many ways it's akin to, let's make the Roman Empire great again. Let's go back to the days when we had everything right. And so he outlaws Christian teachers, and the support that was given to the church is withdrawn. Those payments that were coming from Constantine and Constantius are withdrawn. And for a period from 351 to 363, 12 years, the church really is, I wouldn't say on the ropes. They weren't being persecuted, but they did not have the advantages that they had before. Yet the bishops in those churches still maintained a certain amount of power locally. So Julian didn't last long. But the question is really raised as a result of these conflicts. Where do our true loyalties lie when we're in the church? Is it with the church, or is it with the emperor who gives us our food? When the emperor is no longer giving us our food and no longer giving our sustenance, then what we have left is to maintain our loyalty to the church. And in that 12-year period of time, you can imagine the bishops are maintaining their status with their local congregation, but also they are being raised in their status in the eyes of the people who are still remaining loyal in the church. So, but then an emperor who's considered to be, one of the first great emperors of the Byzantine period, emperor by the name of Theodosius I, who would be succeeded by Theodosius II, comes to power. Julian dies, and Theodosius really begins to put in place some reforms to try to get things back on track the way they had been before. There would be a return to Nicene orthodoxy, as it was referred to. And he makes a proclamation it's written down on page 133, beginning on page 133. This is he wants to establish Nicene orthodoxy once again as the empire-wide standard. We desire, says Theodosius, that all peoples who are ruled by the guidance of our clemency, our being Theodosius, should be versed in that religion which it is evident that the divine apostle Peter handed down to the Romans, and which the Pope Damascus and Peter, Bishop of Alexandria, a man of apostolic sanctity, adhere to. We command that those persons who follow this rule shall have the name of Catholic, i.e., universal Christians. The rest, however, and they shall be smitten. Well, I'll just keep reading. The rest, however, whom we judge to be demented and insane, pretty strong words, shall sustain the infamy of heretical dogmas. Their meeting place shall not receive the name of churches, and they shall be smitten. Great, great word for a monarch, smitten. First, by divine vengeance, and secondly, by the retribution of our own initiative. Isn't it interesting how in his piety, he makes the smiting primarily the smiting of God. They will be first smitten, first by divine vengeance, and secondly by the retribution of our own initiative, which we shall assume in accordance with divine judgment. Basically saying, we'll be working on the side of divine vengeance. We'll be doing the divine smiting as well. Well, this is pretty clear, now where the church stands. And then, of course, Theodosius tries to get everybody back back in line again. He calls a Constantinople, the Third Ecumenical Council, called the Council of Constantinople, where they reestablish, some of the theological ideas that had already been established in Nicaea. But despite the fact that Theodosius was, a guy who, was really supporting the church, seemed to have his own personal piety that was genuine. The bishops, after that 12-year period of time, when they were kind of increasing their status among their churches, started to think, you know what? I think the emperor needs to be beholden to us and not vice versa. So here's the whole question of church and state coming in, right? I mean, it's a very different question than how we understand the United States, but it's similar in some ways. Who has the final authority? And it's going to be a bishop by the name of Ambrose of Milan, who's going to be he's going to push the margin. Theodosius is going to do some things that are going to upset Ambrose. Theodosius is going to ask that some soldiers. Remember, these soldiers were most likely pagans and thus referred to as Arians, that they'd be housed in a local Christian church. And Ambrose said, absolutely not. We're not going to have Arians in our facilities. There's no way we're going to do that. So he tells Theodosius, no, you're not going to put your soldiers in here. These are these are derelicts. They should be smitten by, as you all have already said, right? The other one that I find really interesting, Frederickson mentions these on page 134, 135, but the second infraction is when see, I'll just read it here for you. The second incident involved the Emperor Theodosius. It concerned a synagogue in Callinicum on the eastern edge of the empire in 388. The bishop there had incited a Christian mob to burn down the building. Now, isn't that interesting? Remember, one of the aspects of orthodoxy here, and this goes back, I mean, Ambrose himself, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, was somebody who promoted something called supersessionism. In other words, that the Jewish scriptures have been completely supplanted by Christianity, and thus the Jews themselves have no connection with, the Christian church, setting the stage for later for later persecution of Jews. And this is where I'll leave you on this because we're almost on our time. There had incited a Christian mob to burn down the building, an act that was both patently illegal and plainly disruptive. Theodosius ordered the perpetrators, the people who burned down the building, punished and directed the bishop to restore the structure out of his own funds. Learning of this, Ambrose refused to continue with the Eucharistic service when Theodosius was present until and unless Theodosius rescinded his directive. Resistant, the importuned Theodosius finally acquiesced. This is Becket and Henry, although, preceding, that power grab, between the church and the state, who has the ultimate authority. Another incident got to the point where Ambrose even said, well, gonna excommunicate you. Sorry. And Theodosius, being the faithful person that he was, had to once again acquiesce. So now the question, who's in charge, is being played out in, fine fashion throughout this entire century. We're leading up to a final or a fourth ecumenical council called the Council of Chalcedon. But this, kind of give and take between the church and the empire was going to continue right up until that time. So any comments or questions? More things change, right?
I have just a quick comment on Julian. I think one of your information or slides might have been inaccurate. Frederickson's timeline has his actual reign of from 361 to 363. He was only there for 2 years. And according to, I don't think it's in here, something else that I read, although she mentions it, one of the main reasons he went against Christianity, he was born and raised as a Christian.
Right.
When his cousin took over for the emperor, for Constantine, he got a lot of heat that they weren't being rough enough on the heretical Christians or the pagans. And so cousin Constantinius decided that he'd go out and kill a bunch of Julian's friends and relatives
Hmm.
were viewed as insufficiently Christian, and so that's what got him all uh,
Riled up.
motivated to
Yeah.
to turn on Christianity. And he was, when he became the emperor for his 2-year reign, he was 30 years old.
Right.
And he
Right. Yeah.
went into a different country pursuing and was killed in battle at age 32. And legendarily, his last words were to the effect, the Galilean has bested me.
Interesting. Those dates, I'm glad you brought that up because remember there was still that conflict between East and West, and I think that Julian may have been in the East while Constantinius was in the West, or vice versa, until Julian himself, at the death of Constantinius, became complete emperor for 2 years. I think that's the case.
Yeah, he was emperor of the West,
Over the West, right?
but he was
Right.
only the Caesar of the whole empire for those 2 years.
Correct. Right. Right. Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you.
There's a great historical novel written by Gore Vidal, published in 1964, entitled Julian, and it is, as most of his things are, in my opinion, a really great read.
Oh, wow. I was unaware of that. Great. And it's probably 800 pages long, like Gore Vidal's. No. Oh, that's good to know. I'll have to, though I'm trying to get rid of as many books as I can, I'm gonna have to add that one to my library. So, anyway, any further? Thank you for that, Mac. Any further comments? Then when we return, I think we'll begin with, I don't know why I didn't change these slides to be, we're actually in chapter 5. I'm sorry. But there we go. Yeah, we'll talk about some more theological controversies with the Holy Spirit on the nature of Christ. And then we'll probably even get into chapter 6 next time. But a great summary of the chapter, which I think has been pretty complex, really begins in Fredrickson's last section called the Imperial Church. So if you ever want to just cheat and just read that last part, that gives you a good historical overview of everything that we've done. So, all right. With that being the case, I'm going to stop our share here. And thank you, everyone. It's always fun meeting with you, and I'll see you next week.